Dorothy, an elderly black woman, thought she had finally found peace in her new home. But her neighbors had other plans. They took over her pool, ignored her warnings, and laughed in her face. But when Dorothy had enough, what she did next left the entire neighborhood in shock. Stay until the end to see how she turned the tables. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Dorothy Harris stepped out onto the porch of her new home, the warmth of the morning sun gently touching her face. It had been years since she had felt such peace. After decades of teaching, enduring the constant movement of the city, the noise, and the never-ending responsibilities, she had finally earned her retirement. This house was her reward, a modest but comfortable home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It had everything she'd ever dreamed of: a cozy reading nook, a spacious yard, and, most importantly, a pristine pool, something she had always wanted. The idea of reading by the water, taking a dip in the heat of summer, and enjoying tranquil evenings under the stars had been the very thing that carried her through the exhausting years of work. Now, she was here, and she was determined to enjoy every moment. She had only been here a few days, but the neighborhood seemed promising. The Watsons, an elderly couple across the street, had greeted her with warm smiles. The young couple next door had even brought over cookies as a welcome gift, their baby resting in a stroller beside them. The atmosphere was welcoming, peaceful, everything she had hoped for. But then there were the Marshalls. Dorothy had first met Chuck Marshall the day she moved in. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a booming voice, the kind of man who commanded attention without effort. His wife, Melissa, was well-groomed and polite, but there was something about her practiced smile that felt too rehearsed, too careful. Their 3 children, teenage twins and a younger daughter, hovered nearby when they first introduced themselves. Chuck's eyes had lingered on the pool behind her as they talked, and his words still echoed in her mind. "My kids are already jealous of that pool," he had said with a grin. Dorothy had smiled politely, but had felt something shift inside her, an uneasy feeling she couldn't quite shake. The first week passed without issue. Dorothy settled in, unpacked her things, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of arranging her space. She spent most mornings reading by the pool, sipping her tea as the sun climbed higher. In the evenings, she watched the sky change colors while crickets sang their lullabies. It was everything she had imagined. The neighborhood had its rhythm. The Watsons had their grandchildren over on Sundays. The young couple jogged every morning with their baby in tow, and the Marshalls were the loudest presence on the street. Chuck's laugh carried over from their yard during weekend barbecues, and the sound of a basketball hitting the pavement from their driveway became a regular occurrence. Dorothy didn't mind at first. She had lived in far noisier places and understood that some level of liveliness was natural. The Marshalls were a bit much, but they seemed harmless. That changed one Saturday afternoon. Dorothy had taken a short walk around the neighborhood, enjoying the fresh air. But as she returned home, something felt off. The moment she stepped into her driveway, she heard the unmistakable sound of water splashing, laughter, voices. She froze. Her stomach dropped. Stepping through the gate to her backyard, she was met with a sight that made her blood run cold. Teenagers, at least 6 of them, were in her pool. Some were diving in, others tossing a ball back and forth, and one girl was sitting at the edge, her legs dangling in the water as if she belonged there. Dorothy's eyes landed on the twins. She stood motionless for a moment, trying to process what she was seeing. How had they gotten in? Who told them they could do this? She cleared her throat loudly. The laughter died down as the teens turned to look at her. "What's going on here?" Dorothy asked, keeping her voice steady, though irritation prickled beneath her skin. One of the twins, the boy, shrugged as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "Just swimming. Your pool's really nice, by the way." Dorothy felt something in her chest tighten. "This is my property," she said, crossing her arms. "I don't recall inviting anyone here." The teenagers exchanged awkward glances, but there was no real sign of guilt on their faces. "Sorry, Miss Harris," the girl muttered as she climbed out of the pool. The others followed, grabbing their towels and slipping through the side gate as if nothing had happened. Dorothy stood there for a long time, staring at the water. The ripples faded, but her anger only grew. This wasn't just an innocent mistake. They had knowingly trespassed onto her property, used her space without permission, and acted as if it was completely normal. She wouldn't let this happen again. That evening, she walked over to the marshal's house and knocked firmly on the door. Chuck answered, greeting her with the same easy grin, a beer in his hand. "Miss Harris, what brings you by?" Dorothy wasted no time. "Your children and their friends were in my pool today," she said evenly. "I'd appreciate it if you told them not to do that again." Chuck blinked, then chuckled. Teenagers. They don't always think things through, do they? I'll talk to them, don't worry." Dorothy watched him carefully. His smile remained intact, but there was something in his tone, something dismissive. He wasn't taking her seriously. "I expect this to be the last time," she said firmly. Chuck nodded, but she had a sinking feeling in her gut as she walked back home. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the thought that this was only the beginning. The next morning, she woke up feeling unsettled. The audacity of those kids, the way they acted as if her home was a public park, gnawed at her. She had spent her entire life following rules, respecting others, and expecting the same in return. But the casual way those teenagers had trespassed, the way Chuck had brushed it off like it was nothing, it left her uneasy. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe Chuck would keep his word. Maybe the kids just needed to be reminded of boundaries. For a few days, everything seemed normal. Dorothy allowed herself to believe that the matter had been resolved. She spent her afternoons reading by the pool, drinking iced tea, and soaking in the quiet. The Watsons waved at her every morning. The young couple next door greeted her warmly during their jogs, and the Marshalls kept their distance. Until they didn't. It was another hot afternoon when Dorothy returned from running errands. As she pulled into her driveway, a sinking feeling gripped her chest. The side gate to her backyard was slightly ajar. She walked quickly toward the back, her hands curling into fists. Rounding the corner, her worst fears were confirmed. The Marshall twins were back, but this time they had brought even more friends. Dorothy clenched her fists as she stepped into her backyard, her gaze sweeping over the chaos unfolding before her. There were more of them this time, at least 8 or 9 teenagers, splashing in her pool, lounging on her patio furniture, drinking sodas, and tossing a ball back and forth as if they had every right to be there. A portable speaker was propped up on one of her chairs, blasting loud music that completely shattered the peaceful silence she had come to cherish in her new home. Her patience, already stretched thin, snapped. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise like a whip. "What do you think you're doing?" The laughter stopped. The music kept playing, but the teenagers froze mid-action, their heads snapping toward her. Some looked guilty, others surprised, and a few had the nerve to look annoyed. One of the boys, tall and lanky, with a mop of dark hair, shrugged nonchalantly. "It's just a pool. We thought you wouldn't mind." Dorothy's jaw tightened. She took a deep breath, forcing her voice to remain even despite the anger boiling inside her. "I do mind. This is my property, and you are trespassing. All of you, get out. Now." There was a moment of hesitation as they exchanged glances, as if silently debating whether to argue, but Dorothy didn't back down. She stood her ground, her sharp gaze locking onto each of them in turn. Slowly, reluctantly, they began gathering their things. The speaker was turned off, wet towels were lazily grabbed, and soda cans were scooped up with exaggerated sighs of inconvenience. As they shuffled past her toward the gate, she heard one of them mutter under their breath, "She's such a buzzkill." Dorothy didn't react, though the words stung more than she cared to admit. When the last of them finally disappeared through the gate, she turned back to the pool, staring at the water as it settled back into stillness. The anger bubbling inside her didn't fade. This wasn't just about kids being careless. This was about respect, or rather the complete lack of it. That evening, Dorothy sat at her kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper before finally picking up her pen. She drafted a firm but polite letter, addressing it to the marshals. In it, she reminded them that her property was private, and that she would not tolerate further intrusions. She kept it measured, but made it clear that this was the final warning. Early the next morning, she slipped the letter into their mailbox and returned to her house, hoping that this would finally put an end to the issue. For a few days, it seemed like her message had been received. The twins stayed out of sight and the pool remained undisturbed. Dorothy allowed herself to relax, believing that she had finally put a stop to their antics. The neighborhood remained as peaceful as it had been when she first moved in. The Watsons continued their morning waves, the young couple with the baby still greeted her warmly on their jogs, and even the Marshalls seemed quieter. She should have known better. The following Saturday, Dorothy went out for her usual morning errands, enjoying the calmness of the neighborhood as she made her way through the grocery store. By the time she returned home, the sun was high in the sky, and the air was thick with the scent of summer. But as she approached her house, she heard something that made her stomach drop. Laughter. Music. The unmistakable sounds of people splashing in water. She parked her car and hurried toward the backyard, her pulse quickening. Pushing open the gate, she was met with a sight that made her blood boil. It wasn't just the twins this time. The entire Marshall family was there. Chuck stood by a grill, flipping burgers with a spatula in hand, while Melissa lounged in one of her patio chairs, sipping a cold drink and chatting with another woman Dorothy didn't recognize. The twins and their friends were in the pool, shouting and splashing as they played some sort of game. Someone had even set up a cooler filled with drinks. Dorothy couldn't believe what she was seeing. For a moment, she simply stood there, stunned into silence. Then she found her voice. "Excuse me," she said sharply. The entire group turned to look at her. Chuck, still holding the spatula, grinned as if nothing was wrong. "Hey, Miss Harris. Hope you don't mind. We figured we'd make the most of this beautiful day. Your pool's too nice not to share." Dorothy clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain calm. "Chuck, this is my home, my yard, my pool. You can't just show up here and act like it belongs to you." Chuck waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, come on, don't be like that. We're just having a little fun, no harm, no foul, right?" Dorothy felt something inside her snap. "No," she said, her voice cold. "I want you all to leave, now." The atmosphere shifted. Some of the guests exchanged awkward glances. Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her seat, looking like she wanted to say something but held back. The teenagers paused mid-game, sensing the change in tone. Chuck's smile faltered just slightly, but he still had the audacity to chuckle. All right, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. No need to get worked up. We'll clear out. But it wasn't immediate. They took their time finishing their drinks, gathering their things, making a show of moving at a painfully slow pace. Some of them smirked at her as they walked past, as if daring her to push further. Dorothy stood by the gate, arms crossed, making it clear that she wasn't budging until the last of them was gone. When the yard was finally empty, she looked around at the mess they had left behind. Wet towels were strewn across the chairs. Empty bottles littered the ground. A half-eaten plate of food sat abandoned on her patio table. She had never felt so disrespected in her entire life. As she cleaned up the mess, a heavy sense of disillusionment settled over her. She had moved here for peace, for privacy, for a chance to build a life that was truly her own. But barely a month in, she was already locked in a battle to defend her own space. And as the sun began to set, Dorothy sat by the pool, staring at the water. For the first time, it didn't feel like a haven. It felt like a battleground. And she had the sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. Dorothy spent the following week in a state of quiet vigilance. The violation of her space, the sheer audacity of the marshals and their guests had shaken something deep inside her. She had come here for peace, for privacy, for life she could finally call her own. Instead, she was now caught in a battle she hadn't asked for, one that seemed to have no easy resolution. She had made herself clear. She had spoken to Chuck, had issued her warnings, had confronted them directly, and yet they had ignored her, laughed in her face, treated her property as if it were some community playground. Dorothy had spent her life following rules, believing in fairness, trusting that when she set a boundary, others would respect it. But now, she had to face the hard truth. People like Chuck Marshall didn't care about boundaries. They didn't care about what was right or wrong. They cared only about what they could get away with. For days, the Marshalls were noticeably quiet. Dorothy hardly saw them, and when she did, there was a shift in their demeanor. Chuck, who had once greeted her with his usual smug grin, now barely acknowledged her. Instead of his usual booming laughter filling the street, there was only a brief nod, curt and distant. Melissa, who had once made an effort to appear warm and neighborly, now avoided eye contact altogether. But the twins were different. Dorothy noticed them loitering near the fence more often, whispering to each other, smirking in her direction. It wasn't just avoidance anymore. It was tension, a waiting game. Dorothy was tired of waiting. That Saturday morning, she woke up early and took her time tending to her yard. She mowed the grass, trimmed the hedges, swept her patio, finding solace in the small acts of control she could exert over her space. By the time she finished, the sun was high in the sky, and she sat down with a glass of iced tea, allowing herself a rare moment of peace. Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of splashing water. Her grip on the glass tightened. For a moment, she closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. She had given them warnings. She had spoken to Chuck. She had made it clear. But here they were again, brazenly ignoring everything she had said. She rose from her chair, her body stiff with barely restrained anger, and stepped toward the backyard. The twins had returned, but this time they weren't alone. They had brought even more friends, at least 8 or 9 teenagers in total. Some were floating lazily on inflatable rafts while others played a game of water volleyball. Loud music blared from a speaker balanced precariously on one of her patio chairs. But the most infuriating part, they had brought snacks. Bags of chips, cans of soda, and plastic cups were scattered across her furniture as if this were some public park rather than her private property. Dorothy's patience was gone. She stepped forward, her voice like steel. "Get out." The laughter stopped. The music played on, but no one moved. She took another step closer. "I said, get out of my pool, now." The twins exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One of the boys, the same lanky kid from before, rolled his eyes. "We thought you were cool about it." Dorothy's expression didn't change. "Does this look like a public pool to you?" No one answered. "Get out." This time there was no hesitation. One by one, the teenagers climbed out of the water, grabbing their towels and muttering complaints under their breath. The speaker crackled as someone hastily turned off the music. The entire group moved sluggishly toward the gate, deliberately slow, as if trying to test how far they could push her. Dorothy stood by the pool, watching them go, her arms crossed tightly. Just as the last of them passed through the gate, she caught the Marshall boy whispering to one of his friends, "She's such a crazy old lady." Dorothy didn't react. Not outwardly, but inside, something cold settled in her chest. She had spent her entire life being patient, being kind, being reasonable. And yet, time and time again, people had mistaken her kindness for weakness. Not anymore. She walked back into her house, her mind already racing with her next move. The Marshalls had made it clear that they didn't respect her boundaries. Fine. She would take steps to ensure that they had no choice but to respect them. That evening, she installed a security camera above her back door, angled perfectly to capture the pool and the entrance to her yard. If the teenagers tried this again, she would have evidence. And if Chuck tried to dismiss her concerns once more, she would have proof of his children's behavior. She also started keeping a record, a written log of each incident, complete with dates and details. If it ever came to legal action, she wanted every fact in place. But deep down, she knew this wouldn't be enough. Chuck Marshall wasn't the type of man who cared about logic or fairness. He was the type who believed that rules didn't apply to him, and she had the sinking feeling that things were going to get worse before they got better. She didn't have to wait long. The next weekend, Dorothy returned home from the grocery store, already dreading what she might find. Sure enough, as she pulled into her driveway, she saw signs of yet another intrusion. The gate was open again. The faint sound of voices carried from the backyard. Her pulse quickened as she stepped out of her car and made her way to the back. But this time it wasn't just the teenagers. Chuck and his friends were there. A group of men, 6, maybe 7 of them, lounged by the pool, beers in hand. A portable grill had been set up on her patio, filling the air with the scent of sizzling burgers. The laughter was loud, carefree, as if they had no idea that they were standing in someone else's yard. Dorothy stood frozen in place, disbelief washing over her. Chuck noticed her presence first. His grin widened as he lifted his beer in greeting. "Miss Harris, perfect timing. We figured we'd watch the game and keep the kids entertained. Hope you don't mind." Dorothy's fingers curled into fists. She forced herself to remain calm, but her voice came out sharper than before. "I told you to stay off my property." Chuck's grin didn't waver. If anything, it grew wider. "Relax. It's just a little get-together. No harm, no foul." She could feel her blood boiling. This isn't a negotiation. Get out, all of you." The men exchanged amused glances. One of them chuckled. "Damn, Chuck, she's serious." Chuck sighed dramatically, raising his hands as if conceding. All right. No need to get worked up." But it wasn't immediate. They took their time finishing their drinks, gathering their things at a painfully slow pace. Some of them smirked at her as they walked past. By the time the last one left, Dorothy's yard was a mess. Empty bottles littered the ground. Grease stains marred her patio from where the grill had been. The pool water was murky from all the activity. She stood there for a long time, staring at the aftermath, her anger simmering into something deeper. This wasn't just about a pool. This was about control. And if the marshals thought they could walk all over her, they were in for a rude awakening. As the sun set, casting an orange glow over the quiet neighborhood, Dorothy made her decision. This was war, and she intended to win. Dorothy spent the rest of the evening in silence, her mind working through the events of the day. Her body ached from stress, her hands trembled from rage, but beneath all of that was something colder, a clarity. The marshals weren't going to stop. They had made that clear. Talking, reasoning, even demanding, they had ignored every single attempt she had made to keep them off her property. She had followed the rules, but now she had to accept that the rules meant nothing to them. The next morning, she made her decision. She gathered every piece of evidence she had. The security footage of the teenagers in her pool, the video of Chuck and his friends lounging in her backyard, grilling food as if they owned the place, the photos she had taken of the aftermath, the trash, the grease stains, the pool littered with debris. She compiled everything into a folder and made her way to the local police station. The officer at the front desk, a young man with an easygoing demeanor, barely looked up when she approached. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" Dorothy placed the folder on the counter. "I need to report trespassing." The officer finally glanced at her, then at the folder. With a sigh, he flipped it open, skimming through the photos and notes. "This about kids sneaking into your pool?" Dorothy's jaw tightened. "No, it's about my neighbors repeatedly violating my property and refusing to leave when asked." The officer hummed noncommittally, flipping to the next page. "Did you tell them you didn't want them there?" Her nails dug into her palms. Multiple times. "And what did they say?" She took a deep breath. "They laughed, ignored me, acted like I was being unreasonable." The officer sighed, shutting the folder and sliding it back to her. "Look, ma'am, I understand this is frustrating, but this isn't exactly a criminal case. It's a civil issue. Best thing you can do is talk to them again or put up a stronger fence." Dorothy's heart pounded. "A stronger fence? They broke my gate open last time." The officer shook his head. "Without physical damage or evidence that they forced entry, there's not much we can do. If they come back and refuse to leave, call us while it's happening. Maybe then we can step in." Dorothy stared at him, feeling the weight of injustice settle over her like a heavy cloak. So she had to wait. Wait for them to invade her home again, while she stood there just so the police would consider doing something about it. The officer's expression didn't change. "I'm saying, we have bigger problems than a neighborhood dispute over a pool." Dorothy swallowed down the bitterness rising in her throat. She had known, deep down, that this was the answer she would get. But hearing it still stung. She gathered her folder, turned on her heel, and walked out of the station without another word. When she got home, she felt something shift inside her, a final, unwavering realization. No one was going to help her. If she wanted this to stop, She had to do it herself. By the next day, the fallout from her visit to the police station had already reached the marshals. She knew this because Chuck was suddenly on a mission to make her the villain. It started with the whispers, the lingering looks from other neighbors as she passed, the awkward smiles that felt forced. Dorothy knew how gossip spread in tight-knit communities, and Chuck was doing his best to paint her as the problem. She overheard snippets of conversations when she walked down the street. She just doesn't like kids. She's been causing trouble since she moved in. She called the cops over a swimming pool. Dorothy clenched her fists. Chuck wasn't just dismissing her concerns anymore. He was trying to turn the neighborhood against her. Then came the next offense. It was a warm evening when Dorothy stepped outside to check her mailbox and found something waiting for her. A pile of wet, crumpled towels dumped in her driveway. The same towels the kids had left by the pool days ago. She knew immediately what it was. A message. A taunt. She picked up the towels, her hands trembling with anger, and threw them in the trash without a second glance. The next morning, she noticed something else. A basketball resting against the fence. A basketball that hadn't been there before. She exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of her porch railing. They were testing her, seeing how much she would tolerate. She had already given them her answer. That night, Dorothy sat in the quiet of her home, staring out at the darkened pool in her backyard. The stillness of the water felt mocking, a reminder of what she had lost. And then, for the first time in weeks, she smiled, a slow, knowing smile. If the marshals wanted to play games, she would show them that they had picked the wrong opponent. The next morning, she got to work. Dorothy woke up early, feeling an unfamiliar sense of purpose. She had spent weeks trying to reason with the marshals, trying to handle things the right way, trying to trust that people would respect her space if she only asked them to. But she wasn't dealing with reasonable people. She was dealing with bullies. And the only way to stop a bully was to show them that their actions had consequences. She spent the morning researching pool maintenance chemicals, reading through various articles and forums. She had always known the basics of pool care, but now she was looking for something specific. Something that would render her pool completely unusable for an extended period of time without causing any real damage. That was when she found it. Superchlorination. A common process in pool maintenance, superchlorination involved adding an excessive amount of chlorine to the water to kill off bacteria and algae. When done properly, it wasn't dangerous, but it would make the pool temporarily unsafe for swimming, turning the water cloudy and uninviting. And if she combined it with a foaming agent, the entire surface of the water would be covered in thick, bubbling foam. To someone who didn't understand pool chemistry, it would look like a toxic disaster. Perfect. Dorothy made a list of supplies and drove to a pool supply store on the other side of town. She didn't want anyone in the neighborhood recognizing her purchases or tipping off the marshals. She bought a large container of chlorine granules, a foaming agent commonly used for themed pool parties, and a testing kit to monitor the chemical levels. She also picked up a pool cover, something she'd been meaning to buy anyway, but had now become part of her plan. When she returned home, she carefully stored the chemicals in her garage and began preparing. She studied the exact proportions needed, ran small tests in a bucket to ensure the foaming agent wouldn't cause long-term damage, and mapped out the best way to distribute the chemicals evenly in the pool. Everything had to be precise. The last thing she wanted was to harm herself in the process. Now, all she had to do was wait. She didn't have to wait long. On Saturday afternoon, Dorothy returned from a grocery run and immediately heard the sound she had come to dread. Laughter, music, the unmistakable splashes of people in her pool. She parked her car, took a deep breath, and walked into her house, ignoring the chaos coming from her backyard. She wasn't going to argue this time. She wasn't going to demand respect from people who had none to give. Instead, she went straight to the garage, grabbed the bucket of chlorine granules in one hand and the foaming agent in the other, and made her way to the backyard. She stepped through the gate, and for a brief moment, no one noticed her. The marshals and their guests were too caught up in their fun. Then, finally, Chuck spotted her. "Miss Harris, glad you could join the party." Dorothy didn't respond. She walked straight to the edge of the pool, knelt down, and began pouring the chlorine granules into the water. The reaction was immediate. The effect was immediate. As soon as the chlorine granules hit the water, small plumes of steam curled up from the surface, dissolving into the humid afternoon air. The clear blue pool water churned, shifting into a murky, cloudy gray. Then, as Dorothy poured in the foaming agent, thick white bubbles erupted across the surface, expanding rapidly, until the entire pool looked like a boiling cauldron. At first, no one reacted. Chuck's grin remained fixed in place, but his eyes flickered with something new: uncertainty. Melissa, who had been lounging comfortably, sat up straighter, her brows knitting together. The teenagers in the pool stopped their splashing, their confused gazes shifting from the water to Dorothy. Then one of the guests, a woman sitting near Melissa, leaned forward, her face twisting with concern. "That doesn't look safe." The tension snapped. The teenagers scrambled out of the water, their laughter now replaced by murmurs of unease. One of the boys wrinkled his nose and muttered, "What's wrong with the pool?" Dorothy dusted off her hands and met Chuck's stare head-on, her expression unreadable. "The pool is closed," she said evenly. "You should probably leave." Chuck's grin finally faded. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he glanced between the bubbling water and Dorothy's impassive face. "What the hell is this?" "Routine maintenance." "This isn't funny," Melissa snapped, her voice sharper now. Dorothy tilted her head slightly. "I didn't say it was." One of the guests, a man who had been standing near the grill, shook his head and grabbed his towel. "I'm not messing with that," he muttered, stepping away. Melissa, now clearly unsettled, turned to Chuck. "Let's go." But Chuck didn't move. His jaw clenched, his fingers flexing at his sides, his eyes locked onto Dorothy's. She could see the battle raging inside him. He wanted to argue, to push back, to reclaim control of the situation, but he wasn't stupid. The rest of the guests were already gathering their things, exchanging awkward glances as they slowly made their way toward the gate. Chuck let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "This is insane." Dorothy remained silent, watching as the last of them filed out of her yard. The twins hesitated near the exit, their expressions dark, but they didn't say anything this time. Melissa followed behind them, shooting one last glare in Dorothy's direction before disappearing through the gate. Then, finally, Chuck was the last to go. For a moment, he just stood there, his body tense, his fists tightening and loosening at his sides. Then, with a dry, humorless chuckle, he muttered, "You're going to regret this," before turning and walking away. Dorothy didn't move until she heard the gate swing shut. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. She had won this round, but she wasn't naive enough to believe it was over. The next morning, The silence in the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't just the absence of music blaring from her backyard or the lack of splashing water. It was the tension in the air, a heavy, lingering discomfort that told her the Marshalls were seething. Dorothy sat on her porch with her morning coffee, savoring the rare peace. No teenagers hovering near her fence. No Chuck's booming voice carrying through the cul-de-sac. It was the quiet she had wanted since the day she moved in. But she knew it wouldn't last. By noon, the retaliation came. A loud, insistent knock rattled her front door. She didn't flinch, didn't rush to answer. She took another sip of her coffee before setting the mug down and making her way to the door. When she opened it, Chuck stood there, arms crossed, his face a mask of barely restrained anger. Behind him, Melissa lingered on the porch steps, her expression a mixture of frustration and something resembling embarrassment. Chuck didn't waste time with pleasantries. What the hell was that yesterday? Dorothy met his glare without flinching. Pool maintenance. Chuck scoffed, his jaw clenching. Don't play games with me, Dorothy. You knew exactly what you were doing. She leaned against the doorframe, arms folding across her chest. I did. Just like you knew exactly what you were doing every time you and your family trespassed on my property. Melissa stepped forward, her voice softer but still firm. Look, we get that you were upset, but that was extreme. You made everyone think the pool was dangerous. Dorothy tilted her head slightly. I don't recall inviting everyone to my pool in the first place. Chuck exhaled sharply through his nose, his fists tightening at his sides. You're making enemies in this neighborhood, lady. You think people are going to take your side after this? Dorothy didn't react. She had expected this. She had known Chuck would try to intimidate her. I don't care what people think, she said simply. What I care about is my home, my property, my space. And from now on, I suggest you and your family respect that. For the first time, Chuck hesitated. He wasn't used to being challenged, wasn't used to someone standing their ground against him. He was the kind of man who thrived on dominance, on bending people to his will with charm or pressure. Dorothy had given him neither. Melissa sighed and placed a hand on Chuck's arm. Come on, Chuck, let's go. Chuck didn't move right away. His eyes stayed locked on Dorothy, searching for any sign of weakness, but he found none. Finally, he let out a bitter chuckle and shook his head. You're going to regret this, he muttered before turning away. Melissa gave Dorothy one last glance, less hostile than Chuck's, but still tinged with tension, before following her husband down the porch steps. Dorothy watched them go, waiting until they disappeared into their house before closing the door. She exhaled slowly. She knew this wasn't over. Chuck Marshall wasn't the type to let things go, but she had drawn a line, and she wasn't going to let him cross it again. The next few days passed in uneasy quiet. Dorothy remained vigilant, expecting some form of petty retaliation, but instead of direct confrontation, Chuck took a different approach. He started working the neighbors. It was subtle at first, small conversations on driveways, nods and murmurs as people exchanged glances in passing. Dorothy noticed it immediately. The way Mrs. Watson hesitated before waving at her, the way the young couple next door kept their greetings short, their smiles thinner than before. Chuck was spreading his version of events, and she knew exactly what he was saying. She overreacted. She just doesn't like kids. She's making trouble for no reason. Dorothy had lived long enough to know how rumors worked. The truth didn't matter nearly as much as perception, and Chuck was a man people liked. He was loud, friendly, the kind of neighbor who threw block parties and offered to help fix things. People wanted to be on his good side. Dorothy had no interest in playing his game. She continued her routine as usual, refusing to acknowledge the subtle shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. She took care of her yard, sat by her pool, and didn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her bothered. Then, on a humid evening, she found something on her porch. A package. She frowned, bending down to pick it up. There was no label, no return address, just a small box. She opened it. Inside was a plastic pool float, deflated, with a note scribbled in messy handwriting. "Thought you might need this since your pool is closed. Enjoy." Dorothy stared at the note for a long moment. Then, slowly, carefully, she folded it and placed it back in the box. She didn't need to guess who had left it. She took the box inside, set it on the counter, and stood in her kitchen in silence. The message was clear. Chuck wasn't done. He was still pushing. Dorothy took a deep breath. Let him. She wasn't going to break. Dorothy sat in her living room, the small box still resting on the counter where she had left it. The note, the petty message disguised as a joke, lingered in her mind longer than she wanted it to. Chuck Marshall was still playing games, still testing her patience, still pushing, waiting for her to snap. He had tried to intimidate her, to turn the neighborhood against her, to wear her down. But he didn't realize something. Dorothy wasn't afraid of him. And she wasn't done fighting. She took a slow breath, then calmly picked up the box and tossed it in the trash. She had one more move to make. The neighborhood barbecue was planned for Saturday afternoon. Dorothy made her preparations carefully, ensuring every detail was set exactly as she wanted. The invitations had been delivered earlier in the week, personally handed out to the Watsons, the young couple next door, and several other neighbors she had spoken to in passing. She had been deliberate with her list, choosing only those who hadn't been swept up in Chuck's influence. The Marshalls had not received an invitation. She spent the morning scrubbing down the patio furniture, setting up tables with neatly arranged plates and drinks, and preparing a spread of food that was both simple and inviting. Burgers, hot dogs, grilled vegetables, and her mother's famous potato salad, a dish she hadn't made in years. The scent of cooking filled the air, mingling with the light summer breeze, and for the first time in weeks, Dorothy felt a sense of control over her home again. As the first guests arrived, Dorothy greeted them warmly, making small talk as they settled in. The Watsons were among the first, bringing over a plate of homemade cookies as a contribution. The young couple with their baby followed, smiling as they took seats in the shaded corner of the yard. Slowly, the gathering grew, conversation and laughter replacing the silence that had hung over her home for too long. Then she saw them. Chuck and Melissa stood in their own yard just beyond the fence, watching the barbecue unfold. Chuck's expression was unreadable at first, his eyes scanning the gathering, taking in the sight of the neighbors he had worked so hard to turn against her, now sitting at her table, eating her food, talking and laughing in her backyard. Melissa looked more uncomfortable than her husband. She shifted on her feet, arms crossed, as if unsure whether she should be embarrassed or angry. Chuck, however, wasn't one to back down. After a moment, he leaned against the fence, his smirk returning. "Quite the gathering you got there, Miss Harris." Dorothy didn't look up from the grill. "Yes, it is." He let out a low chuckle. "Shame we didn't get an invite." She flipped a burger, calm and unbothered. It was a selective list. Melissa exhaled sharply, clearly irritated, but Chuck only grinned wider. That's how it is, huh? You freeze us out. After everything, you decide you get to pick who belongs in this neighborhood? Dorothy finally turned to face him, her expression steady. I don't have to decide that, Chuck. You already did. For the first time since this all began, Chuck had no quick response. His smirk faltered just slightly, just enough for Dorothy to see that her words had landed. She turned back to the grill, dismissing him without another word. The barbecue continued without interruption. The guests laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed themselves. It was the kind of gathering that should have been happening all along. Friendly, warm, a true neighborhood event. And for the first time since moving in, Dorothy felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the evening stretched on and the sun dipped lower, Chuck and Melissa eventually retreated inside. Dorothy noticed the twins standing by their driveway for a moment, watching the party in silence before walking inside as well. By the time the last of the guests had left, Dorothy stood alone in her backyard, the soft glow of the porch light illuminating the now quiet space. She looked out over her pool, the water smooth and undisturbed, reflecting the deepening sky above. She had fought for this. She had drawn a line and defended it. And now, standing here in the stillness of her reclaimed home, she knew she had won. The Marshalls would never admit defeat, not openly, but they knew. And that was enough. Dorothy let out a slow breath, letting the weight of the past weeks finally settle. She picked up the last few plates, carried them inside, and locked the door behind her. For the first time since moving in, her house truly felt like home. Dorothy fought for her home, and in the end, she won. She showed everyone that respect is not optional, it's demanded. The Marshalls learned their lesson, and Dorothy finally reclaimed her peace. What do you think about her way of handling the situation? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. See you in the next video.